General Hospital spoilers for Tuesday, August 12, teased that the quiet beauty of the Croatian coastline masked the danger lurking in its shadows. At the exclusive Five Poppies resort, where the air smelled of salt and blooming jasmine, Britt Westbourne moved with an uneasy grace. She had been here long enough to feel the texture of the place, the stone pathways warmed by the sun, the hushed clinking of wine glasses in the evenings, but her time had not brought comfort. It had brought trouble. The attempt to shield herself, to put up the walls she thought were necessary, had spiraled into a situation she could no longer control. Now, a threat hovered close, not loud or obvious, but steady and suffocating, like a tide creeping higher than expected. She wore her black floppy hat like armor, the wide brim shadowing her face. To anyone watching, she looked like a guest who wanted privacy, a woman enjoying a moment away from the world. But to Britt, the hat was more than a disguise. It was her lifeline. Without it, she risked being recognized. And now, recognition was more dangerous than ever. That danger nearly sharpened into reality when Vaughn arrived at the resort, accompanied by Jocelyn Jacks. Their appearance here was no accident. Vaughn rarely made casual moves. Jocelyn, with her restless curiosity, brought a complication Britt had not prepared for. Britt caught sight of them at a distance one morning, their laughter carried on the breeze from the beachside terrace. She shifted her position immediately, angling her hat, avoiding the line of sight. She thought she had been careful, thought she'd managed to keep her presence a secret. But Vaughn and Jocelyn were not tourists content to sip cocktails and watch sunsets. They were moving around the resort, talking to staff, lingering in the same spaces Britt needed to pass through. The longer they stayed, the greater the odds that Jocelyn's gaze would land on her for just a second too long, that some flicker of recognition would spark. Britt knew that once that spark was lit, it would burn quickly. There would be questions, ones she couldn't afford to answer. Back in Port Charles, Alexis Davis was pacing her living room, her mind a storm of worry over Drew Kane's plan to relocate Scout to Washington, D.C. It wasn't just the move, it was what the move meant. She feared that distance would grow into something deeper, that Scout's life would change in ways that couldn't be undone. Alexis had tried to keep her emotions in check, but the moment she heard the news, her instinct had been to act. Her first thought was Monica Quartermaine. Monica, with her calm authority, might be able to see reason, to speak to Drew in a way Alexis could not. But when Alexis called the Quartermaine estate, she was told Monica wasn't well enough for visitors. The rejection, though gentle, left Alexis frustrated. The conversation she needed to have was slipping further out of reach. She turned instead to Jason Morgan. If anyone could bridge the gap, it might be him. But Jason was not a man easily swayed, and Alexis knew it. When she laid out the situation, she could see his expression remain unchanged, his silence weighing heavier than any argument. Still, Alexis spoke, laying out her concerns with precision: Scout schooling, her friendships, the disruption of a stable life. The more she talked, the more she realized that waiting for others to act was not in her nature. The thought took root: a legal challenge. A bold move. She had been through enough custody battles in her life to know they were messy, often brutal, but this was her granddaughter. If she had to go to court, she would. The idea wasn't just a reaction, it was a plan taking shape. Later, Alexis found herself in a tense exchange with Molly Lansing Davis. Molly didn't see things the same way. She spoke of Drew's rights as a father, of the importance of his relationship with Scout. Alexis countered with the stability Scout needed, the risks of uprooting her. Their words cut sharper with each pass, the air between them growing cold. Neither would concede, but Alexis left the conversation with her resolve hardened. Meanwhile, Anna Devane had her own mission, one that led her directly to Jason. She wasn't here for pleasantries, she needed action. She pressed him, speaking in clipped sentences, pushing for him to make a move she believed was necessary. But Jason stood still, the wall he built between himself and her words almost tangible. It wasn't until Anna revealed the source of her information that his stance shifted. She told him not just what she knew, but how she knew it, the channels she had navigated, the risks she had taken. The admission added weight to her words. Jason didn't like being cornered, but now, the choice before him seemed less about willingness and more about inevitability. At another corner of town, Tracy Quartermain found herself in quiet conversation with Cody Bell. There was a certain guardedness in Tracy's tone, but also something else, a willingness to confide. Cody listened, though his own name had come up in more than one discussion lately. Ava Jerome and Nina Reeves had been speaking about him, their voices carrying the mix of curiosity and calculation that came naturally to them. Back at the station, Jack Brennan's confession loomed in the air like a storm that had been building for hours. After Anna left, he broke the silence. He said he had something to confess, the words careful but unflinching. The nature of his admission was still a shadow, but Carly Spencer's presence nearby hinted at where this could lead. Carly had her own way of disarming people, of drawing out truths without demanding them outright. Brennan, however, wasn't certain she would forgive what he was about to reveal. The possibility lingered that his confession would involve Jocelyn, that he had once tried to recruit her into the WSB. If that was true, the fallout would be explosive. Elsewhere, Laura Collins's patience finally snapped. She stood face to face with Lisa Labrecht, hoping to bridge their differences, to find a solution that might serve both of their interests. But Lisa wasn't offering olive branches, she was delivering pointed remarks, each one pushing Laura closer to the edge. When the tension broke, it was sharp. Laura pointed directly at Lisa, her voice firm. She told her she would have to earn her place in Rocco Falconeri's life, that nothing would be handed to her. The words landed hard, the kind that could not be taken back. Lisa, for her part, didn't flinch, but the look in her eyes made it clear this was far from over. Back in Croatia, the sun dipped lower over the Adriatic, casting long shadows through the stone arches of the Five Poppies resort. Britt moved again, keeping her head down, every sense alert. Vaughn and Jocelyn were somewhere nearby, their presence like a thread pulling tighter around her. She thought of the threat she faced, of the choices that had led her here, and for the first time in days, she wondered if she had already run out of ways to keep herself safe. That night fell over the Croatian coast with a quiet that felt almost unnatural, the kind that presses against the ears and makes even the smallest sound stand out. The glow from the Five Poppies resort spilled across the courtyard in warm pools of light, but Britt Westbourne wasn't looking at the scenery. She was watching movements in the distance, listening for footsteps that didn't belong. Vaughn and Jocelyn Jacks had been here long enough for her to recognize their patterns. The way Vaughn scanned a room, the way Jocelyn's curiosity made her linger where others would pass by. The black floppy hat had kept her safe so far, but safety now felt like a shrinking circle. If Jocelyn's gaze locked with hers, even for a heartbeat, there would be no pretending. Recognition would mean questions, and questions would mean she'd have to reveal the truth or run before she was ready. Jocelyn, unaware of the tension building only a few feet away, was beginning to sense that this resort wasn't just a vacation stop. She had caught glimpses of faces she thought she recognized and had heard murmurs from staff when they thought guests weren't listening. Vaughn had been trying to keep her focus elsewhere, but the more he steered her away from certain hallways or terraces, the more determined she became to explore them. In her mind, the trip had shifted from leisure to something closer to an investigation, though she didn't yet know the subject. In Port Charles, Alexis Davis sat in her dimly lit living room, the documents she'd gathered for a potential custody challenge spread across the coffee table. Scout's smiling school photos stared up at her, a reminder of what was at stake. The legal path she was considering wasn't just bold, it was risky, especially against Drew Kane. Alexis knew Drew wasn't acting out of malice, but in her mind, intention mattered less than impact. She pictured Scout in a new city, away from the stability she'd known, and the thought hardened her resolve. Jason Morgan's earlier silence had not deterred her. If anything, it made her more determined to move without waiting for his approval or support. Alexis understood that winning custody battles often came down to timing, and if she moved quickly, she might be able to prevent Drew from making the relocation permanent. Molly Lansing Davis's earlier arguments still echoed in her mind, but Alexis had brushed them aside. Her daughter's perspective came from logic, Alexis's came from instinct and experience, and she trusted hers more. Across town, Anna Devane was replaying her conversation with Jason, gauging how much ground she'd gained. She had forced his hand by revealing her source, but Jason's cooperation was never simple. He moved when he was ready, not when pressured, and Anna knew she'd need to watch him carefully in the days ahead. His agreement to act wasn't a promise, it was a calculation. She suspected he'd already begun to weigh his options, deciding whether to follow through or to quietly find another path. At the Metro Court, Tracy Quartermaine had found herself in another brief exchange with Cody Bell. Their conversations were rarely casual, though Tracy had a way of making them seem that way. Cody had learned to listen more than speak when Tracy was in this mood, and tonight was no different. Somewhere across town, Ava Jerome and Nina Reeves were still discussing Cody in their own circles. Their interest wasn't idle gossip, it was the kind that hinted at plans forming, motives they hadn't yet shared openly. Cody's name in their conversations meant his next steps were already under someone else's microscope. In an interrogation room with the lights humming faintly overhead, Jack Brennan sat across from Carly Spencer. His earlier statement that he had a confession to make hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Carly leaned forward just enough to signal she was listening, her eyes steady on him. Brennan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He knew once they left his mouth, there would be no way back. The possibility of revealing that he had once attempted to recruit Jocelyn into the WSB felt like stepping into open flame. Carly was fiercely protective, and Brennan doubted that any explanation, no matter how strategic, would soften the blow. Yet holding it back now risked more than her anger, it risked letting someone else control the narrative when the truth inevitably surfaced. Laura Collins, meanwhile, was pacing her office, still heated from her confrontation with Liesl Albrecht. Liesl's refusal to engage in constructive discussion had pushed Laura further than she expected to go. Pointing her finger at Liesl had been a moment of raw frustration, but it wasn't a slip. Laura meant every word. In her view, Rocco Falconeri's life wasn't a space to be casually entered. Liesl would need to prove her value, not just declare it. Liesl's silence in the face of Laura's challenge wasn't surrender, it was calculation. Laura knew that in Port Charles, silence often hid more than words could reveal. Back in Croatia, the night deepened, and Brit's movements became slower, more deliberate. The resort was quieter now, but she knew that quiet didn't mean safety. Vaughn and Jocelyn had retreated earlier, but she suspected they weren't done exploring. If they crossed paths tomorrow, the chances of avoiding recognition would be slimmer. She considered leaving the resort entirely, but that came with its own risks. Someone wanted her here under watch, and breaking that watch could trigger consequences she couldn't see coming. In Port Charles, Alexis's plan began to take shape in the form of legal drafts and phone calls to contacts she hadn't spoken to in years. Molly might not approve, and Jason might stay silent, but Alexis was moving forward. She told herself that Scout's future justified every step, every risk. Anna was already moving in her own direction. She knew Jason's involvement was key, but she also knew he wouldn't be her only avenue. If he chose to stall, she'd find others to push the plan forward. Tracy's conversation with Cody lingered in her thoughts as well. She had a knack for seeing connections others missed, and Anna wondered if Cody's name would surface in her own investigation sooner rather than later. In the coming days, Brendan's decision about his confession would set off a chain of events. If Carly learned about the WSB's past interest in Jocelyn, her reaction could ripple beyond personal anger, potentially drawing others into the confrontation, people who had their own grievances with the WSB. And in that kind of storm, loyalties could shift quickly. Laura's clash with Liesl was far from finished. Liesl had a way of biding her time until she could strike with precision, and Laura knew it. For now, the tension would settle into an uneasy pause, but the next time they faced each other, the stakes would be higher. And at the Five Poppies, as Brit lay awake listening to the waves hit the shore, she knew tomorrow would bring less room to hide. The game of avoidance couldn't last forever, and when it broke, it would break fast. The morning in Croatia broke with a restless wind, carrying with it the scent of rain that never quite came. Brit Westbourne stepped out onto her small balcony, eyes scanning the grounds below. Vaughn and Jocelyn Jacks were already moving about, their casual stroll taking them closer to her building. She pulled the brim of her black hat lower and slipped back inside, heart pounding with the knowledge that her time in hiding was evaporating. It wasn't a question of if Jocelyn would recognize her anymore, it was a matter of when. And when it happened, the conversation that followed could burn through every fragile barrier she'd tried to build. Inside the resort, Vaughn had started to sense the tension in Jocelyn's questions. She had noticed the same figure more than once, always avoiding them, always shadowed. Vaughn's instinct told him that if they found her, the answers wouldn't be simple, and they wouldn't be harmless. Yet Jocelyn's stubborn determination was pulling her straight toward the mystery, unaware of the danger that might be waiting on the other side. Back in Port Charles, Alexis Davis finalized her decision. The custody petition for Scout Kane would be filed within days. She knew it would ignite a battle with Drew Kane, and possibly fracture parts of the family in ways that could take years to repair, but her conviction was unshakable. Molly Lansing Davis's earlier words had not changed her mind, and Jason Morgan's silence had only reinforced the idea that no one else would act unless she did. Anna Devane, meanwhile, was already preparing her next move without waiting for Jason's approval. She had other channels to use, other contacts to pressure. Jason's cooperation would be helpful, but not essential. If he chose to stand aside, she would keep moving forward alone, knowing that the clock was ticking on the intel she had uncovered. At the Metro Court, Jack Brennan reached his breaking point. The weight of his secret had settled heavily over him, and Carly Spencer's steady, unblinking gaze left him with nowhere to hide. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. He admitted the truth that there had been a time when Jocelyn was approached for possible recruitment into the WSB, and that he had been part of it. The confession was not dramatic, it was surgical, each word deliberate. Carly's reaction was quiet at first, but her silence carried more power than anger. Brennan had no way of knowing if her next move would be to walk out and never return, or to unleash her fury in a way that could dismantle his already fragile position. Laura Collins and Liesl Albrecht's standoff was moving toward an inevitable escalation. Liesl had said little since their last clash, but her eyes had promised that she wouldn't be pushed into submission. Laura knew better than to expect cooperation without resistance. The fight over Rocco Falconeri's life would not be settled with a single confrontation, it would be decided in a battle of patience, influence, and timing. By nightfall in Croatia, the air had grown heavy, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel amplified. Britt was making her way through the back corridors of the resort when she rounded a corner and froze. Jocelyn stood at the far end of the hallway, her gaze locked on her. The recognition was instant. Jocelyn's expression shifted from confusion to shock to something sharper, questions forming faster than words could keep up. Britt knew she had only seconds to choose her next move. She could lie, deflect, even run, but each option carried a cost she might not be able to pay. Vaughn's footsteps were already approaching from behind Jocelyn, and Britt realized this was it, the moment everything would either unravel or realign. In Port Charles, Alexis received the call that her petition had been officially filed. Somewhere else, Anna was preparing to make contact with a source who could either confirm her suspicions or blow the case open in a way that would force Jason to join her, whether he wanted to or not. At the Metro Court, Carly's next step after Brennan's confession would determine whether his truth became a weapon she could use or a bond forever broken. And Laura knew that the next time she faced Liesl, the conversation would be far more dangerous than the last. The storm over the Adriatic finally broke as Britt took a step toward Jocelyn, her voice steady despite the chaos inside her. The truth, once spoken, could never be taken back, and in this world, truths had a way of starting wars no one could predict.